Hi everybody, welcome to the second webinar in the Climate Change Committee's UK Climate Risk State of the Nation series, this time on the importance of nature and land use. We're just waiting for the numbers to level off, so if you just bear with us for a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Thanks very much. Hi everyone, welcome to the second webinar in the Climate Change Committee's UK Climate Change Risk State of the Nation series, and this time on the importance of nature and land use. We're about to get started, but we're just waiting for the numbers to level off, so bear with us for a few more seconds. Morning everyone, I think the numbers have levelled off, so welcome to the second webinar in the Climate Change Committee's UK Climate Risk State of the Nation series. My name is Professor Kate Jones. I'm Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity at University College London, and I'm also acting here as an expert for the Climate Change Committee. So I'm very excited to be chairing this session on the importance of nature and land use in climate risk and adaptation. So this series, in essence, tries to unpack and explain some of the really key risks identified in the number of reports that we've done recently, specifically the technical report. And then on top of that, we had an advice report, which tried to unpick some of the really key messages from the technical report and give that to Parliament. So that was the advice report. And that was our kind of, from our experts of the UK Independent Assessment of Climate Change Risk. So throughout this series, we're going to be pulling out some key sectors exposed to these priority risks and some of the key challenges raised in the assessment. And one of these is, one of the main ones was the importance of nature and land use. So in this seminar, we're going to first have a presentation covering the natural environment and assets chapter of the third Climate Change Risk Assessment technical report. And this will be given by the lead authors for this chapter who are joining us. Thank you very much. So that's Pam Berry of the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford, and Ian Brown of the University of Dundee. So they'll take it in turns to give you the key salient points from that report. And then we're joined by Brendan Freeman from the Climate Change Committee Secretariat, and he'll present a summary of the advice report that we wrote on top of that, produced by the Climate Change Committee. So then after the presentations, we'll have a couple of short responses from our two other panellists, and that's Ollie Watts from the RSPB and Jenny Phelps from the Gloucestershire Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. So it kind of gives you a couple of different viewpoints on our presentations. And then, of course, we're going to allow plenty of time for the Q&A. And if you're joining through the Zoom webinar, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. So if you just click the link, you can post your questions there. And I think we've just got a little message there from the Secretariat about some instructions. So just have a quick look at that. Okay, so they're kind of the Secretary is just suggesting to keep them short so that we have only a limited time for questions. So it'd be good to keep them snappy. Okay, great. Now over to Pam and Ian. Thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you and good morning. I'm briefly going to take you through the method we used to carry out the risk assessment and a couple of headline findings before focusing on two risks to nature. And then I'll pass over to my co-chapter lead, Ian Brown, who will go through some of the risks associated with land use. Next slide, please. So each chapter in the climate change risk assessment was set the same exam question on the risks and opportunities and vulnerability posed by climate change and the adaptation actions taken and their effectiveness. And we tackled the exam question in 3 steps. Firstly, looking at what are the current and future levels of risk, so what's the magnitude of risk. Then we looked at what adaptation actions are being taken and how are they able to reduce this risk. And then we're looking at what further action is needed. Next slide, please. So we had multiple lines of evidence used to support these steps, and I expect many of you were involved in one or more of these. For example, through supplying evidence on the impacts of climate change or information on adaptation actions, or maybe you participated in the stakeholder workshops or reviewed the chapter. So thank you for your contribution. The Climate Change Committee also commissioned some specific research reports to provide additional information and support for the assessment. So, for example, the Thresholds Project searched the literature for evidence of climate-driven thresholds in the natural environment and their impacts, then used the UK CP18 scenarios and modelled how these thresholds might change in the future and how they might impact particular risks to the natural environment. Next slide, please. So what was new in the climate change risk assessment 3rd round? One of the things that was very important for the natural environment chapter were the interacting and cross-cutting risks, as obviously the environment is fundamentally interconnected, and therefore managing individual risks or opportunities in isolation can have major secondary effects on other risks. Thus, while the risks and opportunities have been assessed individually as per the CCRA3 method, many of the interactions are actually looked at in the latter part of this chapter. Another new aspect was looking at net zero and how that would affect the natural environment, but also how the natural environment can contribute to achieving net zero. We also looked more at notable events or low frequency, high magnitude events. And of course, we had greater emphasis on what was going on in the different countries. Next slide, please. Overall, in the risk assessment, there were 61 risks and opportunities, of which 18 pertain to the natural environment. And 12 of the natural environment risks were assessed as having the highest urgency score, as shown in red here, and another 5, especially the opportunities, as needing further investigation to build the evidence of the impacts of climate change and the effectiveness of adaptation actions. Next slide, please. Overall, 56% of the risks had the highest urgency score, i.e. more action needed, and this is compared with 36% in the second assessment. But it's interesting to note that of that 56%, 2/3 related to risks within the natural environment. So this is obviously a very important area to look at. Next slide, please. This just shows you what the 18 risks were and how they were assessed by country. It was very difficult to make country distinctions given species don't respect political boundaries. Next slide, please. So moving into 2 of the specific risks, firstly, looking at the risk to terrestrial species and habitats. This urgency score hasn't changed from CCRA2, but I think the amount of evidence from observations and modelling studies has increased. And additionally, we found more evidence on the impact of high impact low likelihood events such as severe and sustained droughts. And one of the other things which mirrors what was done in CCRA2 or what was found in CCRA2 is the differential species responses in terms of the way species respond and the rate at which they respond. And this obviously leads to changes in habitat composition and functioning with ramifications for all ecosystem services. And while we were focused on the risks in this particular element, what was especially of concern as well was the opportunities for some species, such as those with southern distributions or those with more than one generation a year. And it was also very difficult to disentangle climate drivers of changes that were observed from other multiple stresses. And I think this was a common theme throughout the chapter, and I think something that Ian will pick up on. Next slide, please. The other risk which I'm going to cover in terms of the natural environment is the risk to freshwater species and habitats. And this changed from being a research priority in CCRA2 to more action needed due to increasing amount of evidence on specific impacts. And also, while CCRA2 identified freshwater habitats as being particularly vulnerable to reduced water availability, freshwater species and biodiversity are highly sensitive to the direct and indirect impacts of temperature as well. And this was picked up more in CCRA3. So for the freshwater, climate change impacts on freshwater species and habitats occurs through increased temperatures. So for obligate aquatic species, water temperature is particularly important, whereas for some other species, air temperatures are also important, such as for water birds. And also the changes in pattern of rainfall and river flow have knock-on effects for nutrient inputs and nutrient cycling. And these may affect eutrophication impacts and affect spatio-temporal changes in species distributions. So again, climate change is likely to impact the state of the freshwater ecosystems and regulation services. And interacting stresses, again, are particularly important. Next slide, please. So thinking about the sort of second step, there are a whole range of adaptation actions that have been proposed or undertaken, many of which overlap with general nature recovery, but often it takes a long time for these to have an effect. So while there's now a reliable evidence base for developing and implementing adaptation plans, we do lack robust metrics or indicators and appropriate long-term monitoring to sort of measure the effectiveness of many of these actions. And so given there's limited evidence of the effectiveness of adaptation, we deemed that this was not fully meeting the need to manage the risks. And so I think, as mentioned earlier, consistent with the ecosystem approach, we recognise that the interconnectivity of the natural environment and managing risks in isolation is not the best way forward. So one of the objectives for this chapter was to try and develop a more systemic approach to these interrelationships and to how they affect other chapters. And this is something we cover at the end of the chapter. But I'll now pass on to Ian, who will take you through some of the risks to land use and draw this section to a close. Thank you, Ian.
Yes, thanks, Pam. So sort of moving on to soils now, and actually soils is at the interface of biodiversity issues and land use issues. So soils in this case is doubly important. So this is one of the risks that were identified as going from medium at present to high in the future under all scenarios. And I should say here, in terms of assessing medium at present, that's based upon the evidence that was available to the CCRA. And there's particular challenges in terms of applying the general CCRA methodology to the natural environment, and particularly to soils. And that's because climate change is acting with a range of other stresses, particularly through land use. So separating out the climate change effect is quite difficult. Although we have good evidence in terms of the risks, in terms of what impacts we're actually getting now. And from that, we can project a quite serious change in risks into the future under a business as usual type scenario, and particular implications for the many ecosystem services that depend on soils. So in terms of adaptation, we identified lots of examples of maladaptation, which is effectively moving the risk elsewhere or increasing the risk through implementing wrong strategy. And the current adaptation, it's good that soils are getting a lot of attention now, but the actual adaptation on the ground is still very limited and often concentrated on particular soils, such as deep peat. So it's not just the full range of peat, much of the emphasis is on just deep peat. So we identified that this is a risk needing more action. And you can see there are some examples that we provided in terms of actions that we think will be beneficial, particularly through changes in land use and land management. And I think one particular issue I'd like to emphasize is soils. Soils are very complex and variable. And we can come up with sort of quite general principles, but what we really need is targeted advice, targeted support schemes. And what we need is the data to go with that in terms of monitoring to understand what works best in particular contexts. So we often say for adaptation, context is important and context is critical, but particularly for soils. Next slide, please. So the next topic is agricultural productivity. This is both crops and livestock. For the CCRA, we combined agriculture and forestry, but here I'm going to separate them out because there's some particular quite distinct issues. Although really they should be both considered together as examples of different land uses. So this is another one where we're assessing the risk going from medium at present to high in the future. The risks predominate, and that's risks in terms of changes in yield, changes in the productive area of land, which is linked to land capability, but also changes in particular individual constituents, such as, for example, the protein content of particular crops, or in some cases, for example, the energy content, which is becoming important in terms of, for example, bioenergy crops. And one thing I think that we picked out more in CCRA 3 compared to previous CCRAs is the effects of changing seasonal and yearly variability. So we often have this sort of what seems like a shift between good and bad years, and land managers and farmers having particular problems in terms of understanding how that has implications in terms of planning for the future. So that's, I think, certainly something to sort of look at more in the future. And obviously there's big issues in terms of productivity, in terms of the effect on the wider supply chain, both for food and drink, but also more and more for bioenergy. So in terms of adaptation, another one we identified, well, I think this is the one where we probably identified the most limitations on adaptation, particularly at farm level. The emphasis is mainly still on reactive responses, and some examples of maladaptation as well. One of the problems we had was we had quite a lot of anecdotal examples of adaptation, but we have very limited systematic surveys of the level of adaptation occurring across the country, so we can understand different regional patterns. And that information is particularly limited on new crops and new cultivars, which in some cases might be providing quite important opportunities. So that links to the actions we recommended in terms of linking with our assessment of urgency. So more emphasis on systematic national surveys of attitudes and practices, better advice, better outreach on the evolving risks and opportunities, and that they needed to be spatially targeted. And I think that links to the point I've just made about soils, that we have particular local context that we need to understand better. There's an important link between these local level assessments and national level assessments. And I think there needs to be more emphasis on the use of particular planning tools. So I've mentioned land capability there. And there's some really good work happening, which I'd like to highlight, particularly in Wales, through the Climate Suitability and Capability Programme, which is showing how tools like that can be used to plan for the future in a different way. And just one final example I can mention there is to look at ways we can shorten the lead times between research and development and implementation. So particularly for this sector, there's sometimes quite long lead times between the initial sort of research and how that's finally implemented at field and farm level. Next slide, please. So quickly to sort of summarize the next one, which is on forest productivity. So this one, similar to agriculture, increased risks, potential opportunities there for new species. Adaptation, there's a bit more emphasis on longer term planning, and particularly with forestry, a good link with multifunctional land use. But also we identified some examples there of path dependency and maladaptation. And the same issue in terms of the information on adaptation is often quite limited. And similar issues in terms of where more action is needed. So particular emphasis on advice and outreach linked to the different risks and opportunities, and to encourage innovation and diversification. And I think, as the point I've just made in terms of linking the different land use sectors together better, so trying to dissipate the boundaries between agriculture and forestry. Next slide, please. So we had a sort of separate assessment of pests, pathogens, and invasives, and this is one where there is a bit more adaptation. So we have got established risk assessment procedures, and they're quite good at identifying existing threats. But what we're particularly concerned about here is emergent risks. So things that are not yet on the radar, but we know that can spread across the landscape quite fast once they become established. So the key issue in terms of requiring more action is to step up, I think, the surveillance, horizon scanning, link this to more cross-sectoral contingency planning, and link this to land use, and particularly developments like integrated pest management. Next slide, please. So the next one was costs. So another one we assess is going from medium to high in the future. And a particular issue here that is important is, as you'll have seen with the recent UK climate projections 2018, is that sea level rise projections are now being revised upwards. So we've got the same issue in terms of adaptation. There's limited adaptation actually occurring at present, and offers often an emphasis on business as usual. But there are some sort of quite prominent good examples of what could be done with long-term planning that includes climate change, and we'd like to encourage more of them. And there's particularly important policy developments at the moment, for example, through the SNP, Shoreline Management Plan refresh for England and Wales, and through Dynamic Coast in Scotland. And I think what we'd like to see is, for the natural environment, a stronger emphasis on nature-based solutions through these policy processes, and to link them with local land use decisions, and to include a range of different climate change scenarios, not just one assumed pathway into the future. Next slide, please. So we had a separate assessment of carbon storage and greenhouse gases. And this is including not just direct climate effects through changes in warming and moisture patterns, but also the effects of pests, pathogens, wildfire risks, and also through the impact of climate change on yields and assumed plans for example, through land sparing. So the risks predominate here, but there's also important opportunities. And this is one where I think we'd really like to emphasize adaptation at the moment is very limited. A lot of the mitigation and net zero assessments seem to assume a stationary climate, which is a bit ironic. And in some cases, there's examples of maladaptation where they're actually increasing the risk. So what we're suggesting in terms of further action is a further stress test of proposed plans for carbon storage and greenhouse gases against different climate change scenarios, to collect and pool data on what works best in different contexts, and to develop better and more meaningful indicators, and to include all land uses, soils and habitats, not just the current emphasis on peat and woodland, but also include, for example, intensive agriculture. Next slide, please.
Ian,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. I'm just really conscious that we want to give some time at the end for questions. So maybe can you just run through the last few slides quite quickly?
Yeah, I think there's just a few left. There's firstly the one on landscape character, which sort of brings everything together. This one's particularly important at a local level because local landscapes mean quite a lot to local communities. And it often includes intangible effects. So I included the Natural England landscape wheel there to include all the different aspects that included. And we'd definitely like to see more action on this, particularly to link local with national scale action. So the final slide, thank you, is just to summarize the importance of land use. And the key thing about land use affects all the risks that we looked at in chapter 3. And that includes marine as well, which obviously should be a priority, and also the other chapters. So land use is pivotal to positive action across a full range of risks, but it's usually very slow to change. And I think what we're suggesting, and we had a section at the end of the report in terms of how we need to bring this together with a more systems-based approach across scales, and to more fully link it with the net zero agenda, and not just to frame things in terms of illusionary certainties such as fixed targets. So that's the finish. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam and Ian. So thanks for a really clear presentation of the technical report. It is an extraordinary document, and I think you've really tried to distill the main pieces there. So there are some really fantastic questions, really hard questions in the Q&A. So please add more in as you go. So thanks very much to Pam and Ian. And I just want to hand over to Brendan. So Brendan's on the CCC Secretariat, and he's going to talk about the advice report that we did to kind of distill some of those big points that they've raised in the independent risk assessment.
Many thanks, Kate, and good morning to everyone. I'm now going to provide you with a very quick overview of the relevant sections of the advice reports that relate to the natural environment and land use. So if you could move on one slide, please. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background as to the advice reports, the report itself lays out the Adaptation Committee's statutory advice to governments on the priorities for their forthcoming national adaptation plans and wider actions. It doesn't summarise all of the 61 risks and opportunities in detail, but it does provide a synthesis of the cross-cutting issues that emerge. Now, as you can see from the diagram, the report itself feeds from a vast pool of material. Now, that included the technical report, so the 7 chapters, including that for the natural environment, which Ian and Pam have gone through, national summaries for each of the DAs. There were also 17 fact sheets that summarise different themes. And we also commissioned 6 research projects specifically to help us fill evidence gaps. So in short, this is the committee's independent take on the extensive range of evidence and produced in the advice report to governments. Next slide, please. Okay, so as Pam and Ian noted, the CCRA's technical chapter identified 61 risks that need to be addressed in the next adaptation plans, national adaptation plans. And the CCC was asked by government to give its advice on the most urgent priorities. Now, drawing on the 61, the committee has highlighted 8 priorities that must be acted on in the next 2 years. And the prioritisation was based on expert judgment and focused on a number of factors These included things such as urgency of action, so where risks and opportunities were identified as with the highest urgency score. They also considered risks and opportunities where the largest gaps in adaptation policy exist. The importance of integrating adaptation into major policy commitments, so looking at things such as net zero, the environmental land management scheme, so ensuring adaptation is given sufficient consideration. Also avoiding lock-in, so ensuring that decisions do not lock in policies and technology that are not resilient. And finally, areas where there are clear opportunities for progress during the current Parliament, so things such as the Environment Bill, where it's essential that we ensure it's fit for purpose through climate proofing it both now and into the future. Now, of the 8 priority areas, the committee identified 4 of those related to the natural environment, and these included risk terrestrial, freshwater, habitats and species, risks to soil health and increased flooding and drought, risks to natural carbon stores and sequestration, leading to greater emissions, and risks to crops, livestock and commercial trees from a range of different hazards. Next slide, please. So as mentioned previously, the importance of integrating adaptation into major policy commitments was one of the factors considered by the committee when they were identifying the 8 key priorities. And one of the major policy commitments, of course, over the next 12 months will be net zero. So the advice report emphasised that achieving this goal effectively will require a dual approach. So not only reducing emissions, but also ensuring we adapt to the changing climate. And this will require a range of different integrated approaches, both for adaptation and net zero. So looking at things like mixed tree species planting, ensuring the right tree is planted in the right place, doing more extensive peatland restoration, etc. But of course, in order for the natural environment to provide this vital support that will be key, it must be in a good enough condition. And as the assessment notes, this isn't necessarily the case at the moment. So the evidence indicates that soil health is increasingly impacted by climate-related hazards, such as flooding and drought. Also, heavier rainfall is causing erosion and compaction in our soils. The UK's peatlands and wetlands will also be vitally important, as they're a significant store of CO2. However, the area of land suitable for peat-forming vegetation in the UK's uplands faces serious risks. So the analysis has shown that there's a possible decline of between 50% and 65% by the 2050s due to climate change alone. This will have a serious impact on these habitats' ability to store and sequester carbon. Now, the productive agriculture and forestry sectors will also be essential to delivering net zero, not to mention other key policy objectives such as food supply, both now and in the future. However, the assessment concludes climate change poses a direct risk to crops, livestock and commercial trees from a range of different threats, including heat stress, drought stress, waterlogging, etc. Now, wildfire is particularly significant, and there's already worrying trends which have been coming through indicators that we've used in our recent assessment. So it's found that in 2019 alone, there was recorded the highest ever number of wildfire incidents in the UK since records began in 2008. So an area 30,000 hectares in size. So that's in relative terms the size of a region of Liverpool. So I guess the resounding message from this is that we will not be able to rely on nature to sequester the carbon unless we ensure that our peat, our trees and our wetlands are healthy. Next slide, please. Okay, so what can be done to reduce vulnerability to climate change across the key priorities that were identified by the committee? So the assessment highlights the importance of nature-based solutions, or NBS, and this can take many forms, and I've touched on a number of them already in previous slides. But these can include restoring peatlands, so both for the carbon sequestration and carbon storage abilities, but also the range of other services it provides, so things such as water filtration and habitat provision. also increasing woodland planting rates, but ensuring that the right trees are planted in the right places. Also planting more trees near waterways to ensure that the freshwater habitats and species have shade, things such as that, and tempering or limiting high water temperatures. And also in terms of urban environments, so green infrastructure. So this can range from large scale down to the smaller scales, so such as green roofs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I guess an important point to note is that adaptation is happening. The concern, however, is that new evidence shows the gap between the level of risk we face and the level of adaptation underway has also widened. Now, the UK does have the capacity and the resources to respond effectively to these risks, and the government needs to take the lead in implementing the action needed. But the assessment finds its response has, as yet to date, not been sufficient. In fact, it's noted in both the assessment and our most recent progress report that adaptation is yet to be successfully integrated across government. On a more positive note, there's scarcely been a better time to strengthen the design of policies to support adaptation. And the current review of the environmental policy following our departure from the EU, as well as the higher priority given to restoring nature, means that there's now a time-limited opportunity to build adaptation explicitly into the policies that our natural environment needs, and also the services it provides. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've spoken about the types of adaptation actions that need to be taken, but for adaptation to be effective, understanding how we frame and plan the actions required to address the risk is as important as the action taken. So in addition to assessing risks and thinking about the benefits of acting now, the committee also reviewed the evidence and adaptation gap in the risk assessment. From that, the committee has recommended 10 principles for good adaptation planning, and these should form the basis of the next round of national adaptation plans. So to be clear, these are intended to bring adaptation into mainstream consideration, both for government and business. Now, some of these principles are about good long-term planning, such as integrating adaptation into other policies, planning for a 2 and 4 degree warming levels, and preparing for unpredictable extremes, as noted in the independent assessment. Others are about making good decisions that maximize benefits and costs, so avoiding lock-in things such as that. Of all these principles, now all of these principles need to sit within a vision for a well-adapted UK. So there is a clear aim and underpinned by proper resources and metrics. Unfortunately, this isn't always a given, and it certainly hasn't been the norm for the UK in the last 10 years, as the report shows. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brendan. That was brilliant. We're really lucky to be joined by a couple of panellists to give some expert opinion on the report. So I just want to firstly go to Ollie Watts and then come on to Jenny Phelps. So Ollie, please give us your thoughts.
Thanks, Kate. And I'll try and be quick because we need time for questions too, although this may answer one or two of the questions. So good morning, everybody. So it's really striking that nature is really at risk from climate change. You look at the big chart of the 61 risks, species and habitats, top left-hand corner, N1, really, really important. So we know we're in a nature crisis. We know we're in a climate crisis. These things too are absolutely interlinked. And I think the question to ask is, why is this gap of adaptation widening when we know that we have these two big problems? And I just wonder whether some of it is down to our mindset and the language that we use. Nature conservation is all about, well, we've moved from protection to conservation, but we haven't yet moved to be forward looking. And the mindset is still restoration, recovery, regeneration, and redoing a lot of things. And one of those is a word that I'm not very keen on in terms of adaptation, which is resilience. Because I don't think it's forward-looking enough. And this is not just for nature, this is societal too. And another thing which is also societal is that the way that we do things at the moment actually works in conservation terms in the places where we can use it, for example, on nature reserves. So we're used to doing things in the right, in a way that we have familiarity with and which works. And again, we need to move forward from that. And in nature conservation, we're actually in quite exciting times at the moment with some novel approaches. Talking about networks, rewilding, nature-based solutions, and so on and so forth. And yet the adaptation gap is still widening. So that's why I'm really heartened to see the advice from the Committee on Climate Change Committee to adapt for a 2-degree world and assess for a 4. Because I think this is hugely important. I think this provides a firm place to look at into the future and to change the mindset, not just to do things as we are, but to accept and understand this pathway and trajectory of change that we're on. That one of Pam's slides about the temperature thresholds really showed clearly that we have to now look at life in an adaptation of change. Nature conservation has to understand change in a way that we never had before, as many other societal risks do too. And that's why I was quite keen to see N18 looking at landscape characters in a new light. And actually the Berne Convention requires us, for our nature reserves, to understand change and imagine the future. So doing all this, I think it is really, really important. And I think I would like to see us change from looking at climate change as a negative response, building resilience against things, and resilience is about coming back from things, to actually having a positive outlook, not quite as one of the questions that's come in is our species moves on, quite opportunities in a way, they are in some respects, but at least to embrace change and make the best of change. This is the world that we are now living in, and I think the 2-degree world provides a really important milestone to understand that and make the best in our adaptation for both nature and for people. Thanks.
Thanks, Ollie. Some really great stuff there. Jenny, can I quickly turn to you? I know there are loads of great questions that we want to get to, so please go ahead, Jenny. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much indeed. I just would like to thank the authors of this report. I think it's the most extraordinary evidence that we need to be able to be the foundation for urgent climate action and response from the government. It also picks up on the lack of coordinated response we've had from the government already, and how that could be. We can offer an opportunity of how that could be systemised. It alludes to the fact we do need a systems approach to delivering this at a local level, but acting in a global context. We already have that in a research and evaluated framework that's been out there that we developed over 15 years ago now. The local delivery and joining things up at a local level is the only way we can integrate this action, and that there's a template that we use at a county level that is bespoke, that actually can enable this to be transferable and locally relevant, which the report also alludes to, that need for adaptation at a local level, integration at a local level. And the main the need we have is for urgently having advisors out, climate action advisors, who can work to join up the social, economic and environmental needs of taking this action. And we can particularly working with the Geospatial Commission and looking at very much systemising the role of organic matter in soils, regenerative agriculture, have a template of working with groups of farmers, with groups of parishes, building climate action at a local level, but actually responding to local plans that have declared climate emergencies, county councils that are now going to have local nature recovery strategies, and integrating post-COVID economic recovery into our social, economic and environmental requirements post-Brexit, with all the changes in environmental policy. So I'd just like to say we do have a framework for action. We would love to share it with you. We think that it's long overdue. We've been championing a local approach for a very long time. And what I would really like to call for is at least 1,000 climate emergency officers out there to enable social capital to be released for people worrying about eco-anxiety, to be able to take action working with their farming communities, to have transformative regenerative approaches. And finally, I'd like to say I think our record centres need to be funded so that our whole society can understand where nature is and how they can act to protect it. And without that evidence being available in a free form for our communities and farmers to know how we can protect species, the movement of species, management of the landscape for water, soil and habitat connectivity, we need to know where our species are and have that freely available to us. So thank you so much for this report. It really will be a foundation for us, hopefully enabling joined up local delivery on the ground. So thank you very much. Thanks,
Jenny and Ollie and all of the panellists and the speakers. just now. It's really great to have, you know, the land use owners, landowners, farmers, and the NGOs together on the panel. It's really brilliant for you to be here. So I'm just going to start to look at the question and answers, and some really brilliant questions, some of which have been answered already, but there was one which I thought was really interesting. I think we should just talk about, and it's from Mark Jacob, who asked whether the panel have identified evidence gaps which they would recommend are prioritised. And I know that we talked a lot about this in the committee. So maybe Ian or Pam or Brendan would like to have a go at that.
Well, I think, as I sort of put in my responses, and as I said in my presentation, I think for me the number one is gathering sound evidence on the effectiveness of individual adaptation actions, because I think, as been said, you know, adaptation actions are very context dependent as well, given the heterogeneity of the natural environment. And so I think if we have a better understanding of what works where and how effective it is and how we can make them more effective, that for me, I think, is the number one, and ties in with Jenny's point about sort of, you know, local records office and so on, because they can help to perhaps provide that and provide also some evidence on monitoring.
Ian.
Yeah, I think Pam's sort of said exactly what I was going to say, but particularly the emphasis on linking that to monitoring at a sort of systematic scale. And we often put it in terms of understanding what works where and when, and we really need to do that at a much larger scale to understand what's really happening.
Ollie, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, very quickly. I think we need to understand more about what the 2-degree world looks like. And I would love to see an indicative nature map for the UK as a 2-degree average global temperature rise, so we can start to plan for where things will be and where we can make what actually the best of nature looks like about future time. Well, and it's what, we're 2 or 3 decades away. So if we get on with that now, we can actually then do it on the ground.
Brendan, did you want to add anything?
No, just to repeat really what Pam and Ian had said. I mean, the monitoring side of things is a clear evidence gap, but not just in terms of the actions. I mean, they are very important, but throughout the whole process. So identifying the actions that are being taken, how they are effectively being delivered, but also the impact that they're having. So how they're reducing risk. I think the issue here is clearly identifying the links between impact and reductions in vulnerability. So any research that we can have in that area, I think, would be really helpful.
Thanks. I'm just going to skip on to another question, which was upvoted quite a lot by a lot of people. And that was about which organisations do you think have the most power to influence adaptation in terms of nature and land use? So who wants to take that one?
I don't like the word power. The only way we're going to solve this is through collaboration and respecting and valuing every organisation's role to do this together. And what you need to do that is to have people on the ground who can value not only local knowledge, local resource, every type of knowledge, but all the organisations that have an essential role to play a part. And I think that this is the really thing that worries me about this, is sort of the human species. We seem to see this as a competition with each other, that actually, you know, somebody's going to be achieving something better than we are, and we just have to dismiss that and do this together. And I think that collaboration is absolutely key, and it would be cost beneficial for the Treasury. In our work that we found that every community has over 75 interested parties wanting to do something in that locality. There's nobody's job to join that up. There's hundreds of different organisations who want to play a part, but actually joining that up at a local level would be so cost beneficial. And training these advisors is what we urgently need to do. I've been doing it for 5 years, but we need the resource to do it so people can act now. And the funding, the resource is out there to do this. The knowledge, the expertise, practical, academic, and institutional level is there. We just need to coordinate it, and that's why I don't like the word power, because it's not a competition. Thank you.
I guess that's really interesting that you think that, well, I think the goodwill is there and you think the goodwill is there. It's just that we need to get a bit more organised to kind of understand how to operationalise that. So that is really inspirational, really. Okay, so let's go to a question by David Danoon. Does the Water Framework Directive effectively consider climate change a freshwater impact and adaptation? And I know that Brendan has looked at a lot of these frameworks over the last few months, so maybe you want to take that one.
Yeah, sure. I guess my answer is in part. So in certain respects, it's very solid looking at certain risks. And when you're looking at risks from water scarcity, it does have the correct elements to it in terms of targets, in terms of research into impacts in a 2 and 4 degree world. It has a set of actions. So it's solid in that respect. However, it's limited in that it doesn't look at the full range of risks. So when we think about things such as higher water temperatures and impacts on freshwater habitats, it's largely ignored to an extent, or at least it's not covered to the extent we would like to see. So I think we do need some mechanism in place that clearly guides our response to risks from higher water temperatures, because that's one of the key risks facing freshwaters.
Thank you. I'd really like to move on to the next one, so I want to bring in all the voices here, especially Jenny and Ollie, to think about this. But this kind of new Agricultural Act and this new DEFRA farming initiative, so what likely impact is it going to be? So I guess this is talking about elms and also the Agricultural Act. So that's Megan Alexander asked that. So please, you have Jenny, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've been involved in the elms engagement group in England for 4.5 years, and one of the things we're trying to get the government to understand is that we need a common platform. We've been recommending the use of UK habitat classification because it not only classifies land use but also the way that it's managed. Working and assessing the ecological function of land management with Rothamsted and others. Welcome everyone in that space. But the point is that if you're going to be able to have a common framework that you want to build your all your different organisational opportunities for, that elm needs to fit within that. So biodiversity net gain, carbon trading, all need to be part of that common framework. At the moment, we're finding that the ambition for co-design is sort of losing track slightly. On the ground, we know what elm needs to do. It needs to catalyse the opportunity for blended finance and natural capital recovery, and it's not doing that. It's got rather stuck. So we're trying to help the government work at a sort of county level so that it can work out how it can invest and catalyse farmers to be able to record the state of the environment actively and dynamically now, record species, work with communities, and start to be able to blend finance from multiple sources so we can make rapid changes to the state of our natural capital, habitats and species on the ground. At the moment, that's not quite happening. We're still working on it. But yes, elm needs to be the catalyst, not displace these other opportunities.
It'd be really great to get some other views on that. Ollie, Ian, Pam?
Not much to add, really. Jenny's clearly the expert on elm, but it really does need to be. It really does need to be forward-looking and to embrace all the aspects of land management in a way that the old CAP never really did. And that's a big ambition. And the RSPB is also pushing for change in that direction as well. Let's hope DEFRA can take up that ambition.
And one sort of point I would add would be to really emphasise the links between the skills. So going particularly from field and farm scale to landscape scale, and encouraging more cooperation at that level.
And if I may just respond, I mean, the template that we have now is of water bodies, all the landowners of every field parcel in a water body working with groups of parishes. And I think you could do this anywhere to enable the individual farm businesses to collaborate together, to share resources and to come together for change. But we need a transitional fund to enable that adaptation to take place. And it's a really difficult time for farmers because they want to keep food resilience at the heart of what we need to do as well. And we can do that through regenerative agriculture, but it's a big shift. It's a big oil tanker to turn, and we need the alignment from the supermarkets. We need relocalization of food supplies. We need dynamic procurements. We can see with ecosystem function attribution to lands how we might even crack food equality. We could make, you know, nutrient dense food affordable for all, and we can see how to do this. And it's very frustrating because it's a template that could quite easily be duplicated by aligning at a county level, you know, your local nature partnerships, your local economic partnerships, creating a natural capital local nature recovery strategy, integrating opportunities at a very local level, but to join these up in a national and international context. And the system is out there, and that's what we've been delivering with. But trying to get the government to adopt a systems approach seems really challenging, and we need to override that and show the cost benefit to the Treasury of that action, because you'll release enormous amounts of social capital. People want to act on climate change. They want to look after the piece of the world that they care about, but in a way that has a global impact. And we can do this. We just need the support from the government or from anywhere to get these advisors out there trained and facilitating action. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. You touched on regenerative agriculture. Then that's a question by Ruth Montfries that she's been asking about. What's the role of regenerative agriculture in adaptation? I think it's got a really big role, but it would be really good to kind of get some views on that from the panel.
I'm very happy, but I've said quite a lot already, so Ollie, you might like to.
So again, I'm not a huge, I don't know an awful lot about farming, but it's quite clear that farming needs to change, and it's really important in very many different ways. And I think just touching on what you're saying earlier, Jenny, while some people do want change, there's also a big mindset shift that we need. Farmers, as you said, want to produce food, and I'm on the Lowland Agricultural Task Force, and there are people who know where we need to get to, but there's a massive mindset change job to get there to actually achieve that. Maybe regenerative agriculture is part of the pathway of that. Well,
regenerative agriculture, from our perspective, is a global initiative that we all see as being the ideal, that we can actually regenerate the ecology of our soils, that underpins ecological recovery. We can build organic matter for water quality and air quality, and mitigating against floods, and we can produce nutrient-dense food, and we can do all these things. And regenerative agriculture is able to help us to do that. What we need is the other mechanisms to enable farmers to transition to that, which we can also see. But I think that the frustration with it for me at the moment is that it's really difficult for these farmers to transition to this. They can see where they want to be, but it needs investment, and that will also really impact on the messages that you give, because we need to do that. We need livestock in the system. We need pasture-fed grazing livestock. That's what will build our soil and build our organic matter. And the message that sort of less but better meat is really strong, but we still need to have livestock in the system. We need to have milk that's produced from grass. We need to let the cows out. We need to, understand that livestock is part of the system. And my fear is a lot of people are getting the headline and feeling that meat is all bad. And from our understanding in international research, regenerative agriculture depends on there being an element of extensive livestock grazing. So those messages are critically important for ecological recovery, because without livestock, we don't have life in the soil, and we don't have an underpinning of our ecological recovery. So regenerative agriculture is brilliant in my view, and could solve a lot of these things, but we need to help our farmers to get there. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. So we're just, I'm just going to run on for just by a few minutes, because we've got so many great questions here. I just want to carry on for a few more questions and then wrap up. I hope that's okay with everyone. So Ian, you were kind of wanting to answer about the path to dependencies that you see in agriculture and forestry sectors. How might these be overcome?
Yes, well, that's a big question. I think the path dependencies are definitely there, particularly in agriculture, and I think in the report we identified quite a lot of them. And I think one way that happens is, and it just links to what we're talking about, often there's a sort of an assumption that there's a quick fix there, and that can be taken from one particular context and applied elsewhere. And that often makes things worse, I think. So I think we had particular concerns around there being some sort of magic panacea that is going to quickly cure all our problems. So particularly in the soils context, we really need a long-term strategy. And I think we need to be thinking about, just in general, more diversification, trying out different options, learning from that. And I think the key thing, and I think that it ties in very well with what we've just been talking about, is this needs to be a learning process. We need to sort of learn to do things in a different way for a different world, for different conditions. So not just to base the decisions upon how we've done them in the past.
Thanks, Ian. I just wanted to switch on to a question that was asked by David Vincent, and Pam, I think you indicated that you quite like to answer this one. So it was just asking whether you guys had had a chance to look at the impact of climate change on keystone habitats and species, and their key roles in preserving ecosystem functions.
Yes, I didn't know if I was going to answer that, but I can. I think, within the chapter, we did not explicitly address keystone species, partly because there's a debate about which are the keystone species, and also obviously we were very much just looking at what evidence is there for the impacts of climate change now and what are the projected impacts in the future as the basis for our assessment. So again, we would need to ensure that that information was there before we assessed keystone species. I think keystone species perhaps become more important when you're thinking about delivery of ecosystem services and some ecosystem services. So it would be an alternative approach, or perhaps an additional sort of sub-risk, but it's not one we explicitly looked at in the chapter.
Thanks, Pam. I guess we've got time for one last question, and I guess I just wanted to pick up on one question that's been upvoted quite a lot here, and it's just about how do we speed this up? So we haven't got long, so how do we speed this up? So maybe if we take everybody in turn, that would be great. So maybe start with Pam.
Thank you. Nice going first. I think for me, the thing that's sort of come out is the need for coordination. And I think if we act together, and I'm a particular sort of advocate of nature-based solutions. I'm not saying they're going to provide all the answers, but I think if we act together in unison, we can speed things up.
Thanks, Pam. Ian?
I think the key thing is we just need to do something rather than just sort of like putting off the decision into the future. A particular issue, I mean, I mentioned it particularly for coasts, and I think we referenced in the report, there's a recent House of Lords report on similar issues, which is effectively saying that we're just putting off these difficult decisions into the future. But we really need to do it now. Okay, in some cases we might make mistakes, but we need to learn from that, because otherwise the risks, as we just identify in the report, are just going to increase.
And increase in cost as well every time we do it. Brendan, thank you, Ian.
Yeah, I think I kind of made a reference to it in my presentation that we've got a really special time now to get adaptation into the policies that are needed, and also the legislation. I think over the next 2 years, with the overhaul of the EU previous policies in place. So if we can act now and make sure that we make the most of this particular time, which won't last forever, I think that will be a key driver behind getting things done.
Thanks, Brendan. Ollie?
Well, all of those things, of course. Just somehow we need to get the urgency of the situation that we're in much better understood. That we're actually on a pathway of a trajectory of change that we have to learn to live with and make the best of, and understanding some of those tipping points, a bit of the opportunities of the future. But really, to make the best of all of our lives, we have to now embrace change and live with that. Thanks,
Ollie. And last but not least, Jenny.
I think we need to act locally and act now, and in a context that gives us, the opportunity to deliver against those wider, feeling that we're part of a national and international delivery opportunity. I mean, certainly from our perspective, we feel working at a policy level with government and working at a county level in delivery, that actually the counties and the districts and the communities and the farmers are acting. They just need support to act faster and in a more coordinated way. And everyone's trying to find their way through to do something meaningful, but it's not structured. And if we had that opportunity to give people simple, straightforward advice at how they can coordinate support at a local level, we would deliver these national policies, excuse me, can't get my words out, those policies as well. But at the moment, the government's just throwing out, at the moment, there's 19 different funding streams that are being put out, and it's all about action on the ground, but not about advice and coordination. And that is the bit that is wasteful, and it would be cost beneficial to get some structure around local action in that wider context. So yeah, let's just all go and do our own thing in our locality and get on with it. Thank you.
Ollie, did you want to come in?
Just one final thought. I think it's really ironic that we put so much effort correctly on mitigation, where actually our contribution globally is essential, but it's actually really small. And yet we have adaptation that's coming down at us like a freight train through the tunnel, which actually really impacts our lives, which we have completely the power to act upon it, and yet so much of the focus is on mitigation and not on adaptation.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't argue with that one, having sat on the adaptation panel of the Climate Change Committee. So thanks very much, everybody. That was a really fantastic session and some really great questions from the audience. And I'm sorry that we didn't manage to answer them all, but some really great questions. And thanks to all the panelists and the authors that came on, and Brendan from the CCC. So before we end, just to say that there are 5 further webinars in this series, the UK Climate Risk State of the Nation, and there'll be a link in the question answer chat box shortly, or the chat box shortly, for you to link to those, and some really fantastic ones coming up. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for watching us, and I hope that was informative and you got a really good flavour of what we've been doing in the technical report and advisory